For nearly 1,700 years, Christians have celebrated the birth of Jesus on December 25th. But the Bible never mentions that date, not even once. In fact, when historians analyze the biblical evidence as a whole, December becomes one of the least likely times of all. If you value evidence-based biblical history like this, consider subscribing. The Bible can give the exact hour a man died, yet it leaves the timing of the world's most celebrated birth mysteriously vague. Why would a book so careful with dates not simply tell us when Jesus was born? That is the question behind this investigation, the real date of Jesus' birth. 7 biblical clues historians struggle to explain. What follows is not an attempt to pin a single day on history with absolute certainty, but to read 7 clues embedded in Scripture and ancient records and see where they converge. Taken together, these clues make a strong case that the traditional December 25 does not line up with the biblical and historical evidence, and that a fall birth, most plausibly September or October, within the broader scholarly window of roughly the mid-6th to mid-4th century BCE in our reckoning, best fits the data. I'll walk through each clue in order, weighing the biblical testimony and the external anchors that historians use. Before we begin, if you want the complete interactive timeline and map that follows the threads I'll describe, showing Joseph and Mary's likely route, the probable movement of the Magi, and the astronomical events discussed, click the companion video that's on screen now. It will help you see the evidence as a unified timeline. 1. The census. Luke. Luke's narrative frames the birth of Jesus with an imperial summons. Augustus issues an enrollment, people go up to their ancestral towns, and Joseph goes from Nazareth to Bethlehem to be registered because he is of David's house and lineage. At first glance, that seems straightforward. An imperial administrative act produces an inconvenient journey that results in Jesus' birth in Bethlehem. But the phrase enrollment or registration, the Greek term is apographe in Luke 2, raises several practical questions that historians have debated, and the answers have implications for seasonality. Roman censuses and registrations were not uniform across the empire. The empire-wide tax and population enumerations varied by region, and the way they were conducted in the provinces could be shaped by practical concerns, local governors, military movements, harvest cycles, and weather. Travel in first-century Palestine was hard at the best of times. Roads were largely unpaved, bridges limited, and the only rapid transport for most people was by foot or donkey. For a heavily pregnant woman like Mary, facing a multi-day trek from Nazareth in Galilee to Bethlehem in Judea, timing mattered. Consider the journey itself. The direct route from Nazareth to Bethlehem is not a straight line. It involves perhaps 60 to 80 miles of hilly, sometimes treacherous terrain, depending on which path was taken. For a reasonably fit traveler with pack animals, scholars estimate 7 to 10 days in good conditions. If Joseph set out late in pregnancy, the physical strain of winter rains and swollen streams could be dangerous. Romans, for administrative efficiency, would have sought seasons when registration could be carried out with minimal disruption, after harvest and before winter gales, or in spring when roads dried and travel resumed. The logic here is practical, not theological. A governor or an imperial edict that forced mass travel would likely be enforced where it could be carried out with the least risk to life and property. Luke's wording does not give us a day or even a season, but the implication of a mass movement of people under Roman orders, combined with the realities of travel and the health needs of a pregnant woman, makes winter a less probable time for such a large-scale registration. The census clue, therefore, nudges us away from December and toward seasons more hospitable to long-distance journeys, most likely spring or early autumn. It does not by itself fix a month, but it filters out seasons and prepares us to weigh the next clues. If the Romans would not have imposed that kind of travel in the dead of winter, then where else would they have done it? And if a census placed Mary on the road in late pregnancy, what do we make of the shepherds who appear later in Luke's account? 2. Shepherds watching their flocks by night. Luke's story of the birth places shepherds at the center of the first witness scene. Rural, marginal, out under the stars, keeping watch by night over their flocks. To a modern reader, the phrase is poignant. The lowly among society are the first to receive the news. To an ancient agrarian audience, it also communicates timing. Shepherding in Judea followed a seasonal pattern shaped by climate and lambing cycles. Shepherds did not keep flocks out in the open year-round. During the cold and rainy months, sheep were often brought into pens or caves to shelter from storms and to protect newborn lambs. The times when shepherds were most likely to stay outdoors at night were the milder months when lambing and grazing coincided with good pasturage, primarily in spring and in the milder parts of autumn. In Judea, the lambing seasons cluster around late winter into spring and again in early autumn in some regions. The crucial point is that open-air night watches are not typical in midwinter when storms and muddy conditions prevail. Luke's portrayal of shepherds by night therefore functions as a seasonal marker. If they were genuinely in the fields at night, it becomes harder to fit the birth into a cold and wet December. Imagine shepherds on a Judean hillside under a clear autumn sky, watching over ewes with newborn lambs, when suddenly a brilliant announcement arrives. That image fits the text and the agrarian rhythm. It also dovetails with the census clue. If registration took place in a season amenable to travel and field work, shepherds being outdoors is more plausible. There is another cultural layer. Shepherds were marginal witnesses. They were not only likely to be outdoors at certain times of year, they were also the kind of people who might be overlooked in a legal or civic account. So Luke's inclusion of them signals the theological point that God's revelation often comes to those on the edges. But for our chronological inquiry, their nighttime vigil is a practical signpost pointing away from a wet, cold winter and toward spring or autumn. What about the star that guided the Magi? That phenomenon introduces a different kind of evidence, astronomical and cross-cultural, and it invites us to bring external records into dialogue with the gospel narratives. 3. The Star of Bethlehem, Matthew. Matthew's account gives us a very different witness. Learned observers from the east, Magi, see a sign in the heavens and travel to Jerusalem, asking where the newborn King of the Jews is to be found. They follow a star that leads them first to Jerusalem, and finally, after a dramatic stopping, to a house in Bethlehem where they find a child. Matthew's narrative leaves space for both natural and supernatural readings. The Magi's observation can reflect an actual celestial event recognized in the ancient sky, and Matthew's description of the star's behavior contains elements that some readers hear as miraculous choreography. Several astronomical hypotheses have been offered to account for a notable celestial sign in the years just before Herod's death. Two categories dominate scholarly discussion: planetary conjunctions and reports of guest stars, novae, or cometary appearances, recorded in East Asian astronomical annals. A well-discussed possibility is a series of planetary conjunctions involving Jupiter and Saturn, or Jupiter and Venus in the late 7th and early 6th century BCE of our calendar. In particular, a close conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn occurred in 7 to 6 BC. For ancient astrologers, Jupiter could be associated with kingship, and its conjunctions with other prominent planets would register as portentous. Some scholars have argued that a sequence of conjunctions in 7 to 6 BC could have been interpreted by Magi, traditionally associated with Persian or Babylonian priest astrologers, as announcing the birth of a great king in Judea. Complementing the conjunction theory are East Asian accounts of guest stars around the early years of the 1st century BC, sometimes dated roughly to 5 BC. Chinese and Korean court astronomers kept careful records, and some entries have been read as references to a new star or an unusual luminous object that would have been visible to observers in the ancient Near East. If contemporaneous observers in different parts of Asia noted an anomalous stellar event, it gives a tangible historical peg that could line up with Matthew's narrative of a sky sign. Neither astronomical explanation is free of debate. Planetary conjunctions, though visually striking to the trained astrologer, do not typically move in the way Matthew describes when the star went ahead of them and stopped over the place where the child was. Those movements are more suggestive of a miraculous sign or of a literary device that signals divine guidance. Conversely, a nova or comet could appear and then disappear, but comets were often omens of disaster rather than royal births in the ancient mind, and some ancient records would have marked a comet as portentous in a negative way. There is another temporal cue in Matthew's story that intersects with the star debate: the Magi's long journey. If they came from Persia or Babylon, the trip to Jerusalem would have taken months, perhaps longer, depending on their starting point and the route. That fact matters because when Herod, alarmed by the Magi's report, orders the slaughter of all the boys 2 years old and under in Bethlehem and its vicinity, Matthew seems to be allowing for a time span between the initial star sighting and the Magi's eventual visit. Herod's decree, whether made out of paranoia or as a calculated measure, suggests that the child whom the Magi sought might not have been a newborn at the moment the star first appeared. Combining the astronomical hypotheses with Matthew's narrative of a potentially delayed Magi visit, many historians infer that the birth likely occurred at least a year or two before Herod's death. Here, the star clue functions on 2 levels: as an astronomical anchor, possible conjunctions in 7 to 6 BC, or a guest star circa 5 BC, and as a narrative sign that, together with the Magi's journey time and Herod's reaction, points toward a birth earlier than the conventional 1 BC AD boundaries. The star alone does not determine a precise year. It widens the window and pushes it back into the decade before Herod's death. But Herod himself imposes perhaps the clearest chronological boundary we possess. 4. Herod's massacre and his death, Matthew and Josephus. Matthew's brief but chilling detail that Herod commanded the killing of children 2 years old and under becomes a critical chronological lever when paired with non-biblical historical testimony. Flavius Josephus, the 1st century Jewish historian, places the death of Herod the Great in the context of events widely dated to 4 BC. This anchor is debated in technicalities. Some scholars propose slightly different datings for lunar eclipses and calendrical markers Josephus uses, but the mainstream consensus places Herod's death in 4 BC. If Herod died in 4 BC, and if Matthew's detail reflects Herod's attempt to eliminate a recently born rival, targeting boys 2 years old and younger, then Jesus' birth must have occurred sometime before 4 BC. That simple arithmetic explains the perplexing truth behind the phrase "born before Christ." The numerical system developed later by Dionysius Exiguus placed the birth near the era now called 1 BC AD 1, but historical markers inside the Gospels push the likely birth earlier. How far earlier? If Herod sought boys up to 2 years old, historians infer that Herod's action reflects an interval of perhaps up to 2 years between the initial sign that prompted the Magi and Herod's final ordering. coupled with the astronomical hypotheses that place a possible star in 7 to 6 BC or a notable guest star near 5 BC, and with Josephus's dating of Herod's death around 4 BC, the convergence favors a birth sometime in the mid-first decade before the Common Era, as reckoned by many modern chronologies, commonly argued as roughly 6 to 4 BC, with several respected reconstructions centering around 5 BC as a strong candidate. That conclusion still bears the cautions we began with. It is a probable range, not an incontrovertible pinpoint. Josephus's chronology, while valuable, is not a simple ledger. He composed his histories decades later and worked with calendars and sources that require modern correction. Astronomical reconstructions, too, depend on accurate interpretations of ancient records and on assumptions about how ancient astrologers read the sky. Yet the combined force of Matthew's narrative detail and Josephus's historical anchor creates an evidentiary fence. Jesus was most likely born before 4 BC and probably within that mid-decade window. At this point, the picture looks as though the year of Jesus' birth can be bracketed by Herod's death and by Luke's later dating of Jesus' ministry. But the question of season, was it summer, spring, winter, or autumn, needs different markers. That's where Luke's unique material about priestly rotations and John the Baptist enters the scene. End of this segment of the investigation. The next clues bring Zechariah's priestly division, the Feast of Tabernacles, and Luke's dating of Jesus' ministry into conversation, and they will show how the months narrow towards September-October. The clues so far have pushed us away from winter and earlier than 4 BC, but the story is not finished. We will now trace the priestly timetable that sets the clock for John the Baptist's conception, and from there, by simple arithmetic, the likely months for Mary's conception and Jesus' birth.
5. Zechariah's priestly service and the timing of John's conception. Luke gives us a surprisingly precise domestic clock in the story of Elizabeth and Zechariah. Zechariah is identified not simply as a priest, but as of the division of Abijah, Luke 1:5-8. That reference presses us into the calendar of temple service. According to 1 Chronicles 24, David organized the priests into 24 courses, phili, which each served in turn at the temple. By the 1st century, Jewish practice still followed a rotation. Each course served for a week twice a year, with the first course beginning at the festival of Passover, Nisan. If we place the first week in Nisan and count forward, the 8th course, Abijah, would serve in the spring, roughly in the month that corresponds to late April or May in our modern reckoning. That is the basic calculation many historians and chronologists use when they read Luke's detail as a seasonal marker. Luke's scene places Zechariah in the sanctuary, performing incense duty when Gabriel appears, Luke 1:8-11. After the angel's message, Elizabeth conceives. Luke then tells us that Mary visited Elizabeth in the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, Luke 1:24-26. From those two pivots, Zechariah's priestly week and the 6th month's later remark, we can build a chain of plausible dates. If Abijah's week is in late spring, again roughly around Iyar in the Jewish calendar, which maps to April-May, then Elizabeth conceives in that late spring interval. 6 months after that moment is roughly November-December, the time Luke says the angel appeared to Mary. 9 months after Mary conceives would put the birth of Jesus in the Tishri season, approximately September-October. Put simply, Zechariah's service, spring, John's conception, spring, 6 months later Mary's conception, late autumn, early winter, 9 months later Jesus' birth, early autumn of the following year. That arithmetic is straightforward. What makes it compelling is that it links an otherwise obscure temple detail to a sequence of pregnancies and visits that Luke intentionally records. This argument depends on two assumptions that require modest caution. First, it assumes the standard schedule of priestly rotation anchored to Nisan, while Luke evidently expected his readers to recognize Abijah's placement in the calendar. Some scholars debate the exact mapping of courses to months because local practices could vary. Second, the 6 months statement is a literary marker. Luke's theology is at work here, not a civil registrar's logbook. Still, the chain of events Luke provides is internally coherent and yields an autumnal birth if we follow the most natural calendrical reckoning. Taken together with the earlier clues, census logistics and shepherds outdoors, the priestly rotation calculation nudges the season away from midwinter and toward the harvest feast period of early autumn.
6. Sukkot imagery and John 1:14. Tabernacling in Tishri. Luke's sequence gives us arithmetic. John's Gospel gives us poetic coloring. John 1:14 famously states, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." The verb translated dwelt is the Greek eskenosin, which literally evokes pitching a tent or tabernacling, an image John likely intends to evoke the tabernacle, Hebrew sukkah or mishkan, the temporary dwelling of God among Israel in the wilderness. For first-century readers aware of Jewish festival imagery, the language naturally echoes the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot, the autumn pilgrimage festival that commemorated Israel's wilderness dwelling and celebrated God's providence at the time of the ingathering of the harvest. Sukkot occurs in Tishri, the 7th month of the Jewish year, usually falling in our September or October. It is a festival of lights and the presence of God. It is both a thanksgiving for harvest and a theological reenactment of God's dwelling with his people. If Jesus' birth took place in Tishri, the Johannine language dwelt among us gains a poignant liturgical echo, the incarnation tabernacling among humanity at the very season when Israel remembered God's tented presence. John does not provide a birth calendar, of course, but the thematic resonance is striking. It would be theologically fitting, though not proof, that the Word takes flesh in the very month when Israel celebrates God's dwelling among them. There are further pastoral and scriptural resonances with an autumn birth. Sukkot is a festival of lights, connecting well with Matthew's narrative of Eastern Magi following a heavenly light. It is a festival of pilgrimage, when Judeans converged on Jerusalem, an interesting backdrop to the Bethlehem narratives where travelers and pilgrims are central. The festival's emphasis on harvest and rejoicing harmonizes with the gospel motifs of fulfillment, rejoicing, and divine provision. Again, such correspondences are not ironclad evidence. They are suggestive patterns that add theological weight to the calendar hinted at by Luke's priestly chronology. In the cumulative method of historical inquiry, where multiple independent signals reinforce a single conclusion, the Sukkot image strengthens the case for a September-October birth window. 7. The 15th year of Tiberius and the about 30 formula, Luke. Luke provides a civic anchor for the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. He locates John the Baptist's activity in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Luke 3, verse 1. That datum has been used by historians to date the start of Jesus' ministry to roughly AD 28 to 29, depending on how one counts Tiberius's years. Some count from his co-regency, some from his becoming sole emperor. Luke also reports that Jesus was about 30 years of age when he began his ministry. Luke 3, verse 23. Most interpreters take about 30 as an approximation. Jesus was around 30, give or take a few years, rather than a strict chronological ledger. From this point of view, put Luke's civic marker and his age statement together and subtract roughly 30 years. The arithmetic lands us somewhere in the period conventionally given by other evidence, several years before the beginning of the 1st century AD. How those years are mapped will vary with the counting method. If one places the start of Jesus' ministry in AD 28 and reads about 30 as C 30, simple subtraction suggests a birth sometime around 2 to 1 BC. That looks at first like a mismatch with the Herod-Josephus evidence that favors before 4 BC. But the phrase about 30 allows room. It could mean late 20s or early 30s. If Jesus were actually 32 or 33 when he began to be publicly active, then subtracting yields a birth in the mid to late first decade BC. The safest way to handle this clue is to stress its corroborative function rather than its determinative power. Luke's dating of the start of ministry is a useful chronological peg. His about 30 remark is an imprecise age marker. Together, they suggest an origin in the years that align comfortably with the range bounded by Herod's death and the astronomical hints, roughly somewhere between 6 and 4 BC. That convergence is the point. Independent anchors in the Gospels, Herod's death detail, Luke's temple rotation, Luke's ministry dating, overlap in a way that gives historians a consistent, if not perfectly pinpointed, window for Jesus' birth. Synthesis: how the 7 clues cluster. By now, the pattern should be apparent. The 7 clues split neatly into 2 complementary sets. 4 clues, Herod's death and the massacre, Matthew plus Josephus, the astronomical possibilities and the Magi's timeline, Matthew plus astral records, Luke's census and its practical implications, and Luke's dating of Jesus' public ministry cluster to constrain the year of Jesus' birth. They place him before 4 BC and most plausibly within a mid-first decade window, with many scholars favoring a date around 6 to 5 BC. 3 clues, Zechariah's priestly rotation and the timing of John's conception, Luke 1, shepherds keeping watch by night, Luke 2, and the Johannine tabernacling imagery suggestive of Sukkot, John 1:14, give us seasonality, pushing the likely month toward early autumn, most commonly argued as September or October. Put differently, the year is bounded by historical and astronomical evidence, the season is constrained by agricultural practices, temple calendars, and liturgical imagery. When read together, these independent signals create a cumulative case that is more persuasive than any single data point. None of the clues in isolation proves the exact day. Together, they make a best-fit argument that historians cannot easily dismiss.
That is why the claim at the heart of this investigation is careful. We can argue with reasonable confidence for a fall birth within the mid-first decade BC window, but not for a precise date down to the day. Why December 25th? How did a different date win out? If all that evidence points away from midwinter, why did December 25th become so dominant in Christian liturgical life? The answer is a mixture of theological symbolism, liturgical convenience, and the broader religious culture of the Roman Empire. First, early church thinkers sometimes used theological reasoning to compute significant dates. A strand of patristic tradition associated the date of Jesus' conception with the date of his death, reasoning that the 2 great moments of his saving work, incarnation and atonement, might mirror each other on the calendar. Several early sources placed the crucifixion on March 25. Add 9 months, and you arrive at December 25. This conception equals death arithmetic appears in multiple early Christian writers and carried persuasive force for communities seeking symbolic coherence. Second, by the 4th century, the Roman Empire had competing midwinter festivals, most famously Saturnalia and later the festival of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, celebrated on December 25th. As Christianity became the empire's dominant religion, some bishops and communities adopted December 25th for celebrating Christ's birth, in part to provide a Christian focus for the midwinter season. That was not simply capitulation, it was also a way to see the light theme of the Incarnation fitting naturally into the season when daylight is at its briefest and people long for the return of light.
Third, the development of the Anno Domini dating system by Dionysius Exiguus in the 6th century reshaped Christian chronological thinking. Dionysius attempted to place the Incarnation at the center of historical reckoning, but his calculations were not based on the kind of convergent historical analysis we use today. They were theological lunar calculations done in a different scholarly milieu. The mismatch between Dionysius's assignment and the internal gospel markers discussed above is one reason why the phrase "before Christ" makes literal historical sense. The gospel narratives and external sources point to a birth before the era later labeled as Anno Domini. All of this means that December 25th is a historically late, theologically motivated, and pastorally meaningful adoption, even if it does not sit comfortably with the cumulative historical case for an autumn birth. That mismatch is not a scandal. It is a testimony to how communities form liturgical rhythms out of theology, culture, and pastoral need. Celebrating on December 25th does not deny the plausibility of September-October as the historical season. Rather, it is a separate, later tradition shaped by a different set of concerns.
Objections, uncertainties, and scholarly alternatives. A responsible historical account must acknowledge counterarguments. Some scholars emphasize that Luke's enrollment could have been triggered by a local or provincial registration that did not require long-distance travel. Others argue that shepherding practices varied across Judea, and that pockets of shepherds might have kept watch at night even in winter. Astronomical proposals are contested. Planetary conjunctions do not behave like the star in Matthew's story, and East Asian records are often ambiguous. Josephus's chronology has its own debates over lunar eclipses and calendrical reckonings that could tweak Herod's death year by a small margin. Moreover, the harmonization of Luke's priestly rotation with exact months rests on interpretive choices about when the priestly year began and about how the rotations were scheduled, a matter not entirely settled among specialists. And Luke's about 30 language is notoriously imprecise, offering considerable latitude for dating. These alternative readings matter, and they temper our confidence. They are the reason the claim advanced here is presented as a best-fit conclusion rather than a definitive verdict. Good historical method values convergence. When multiple independent signals point in the same direction, confidence increases. Here we have several independent pointers: imperial records and logistics, pastoral practice, astronomical possibilities, temple rotation, literary imagery, and Luke's ministry dating that point toward a birth before 4 BC and toward an autumn season. That convergence is stronger than any single clue taken alone, and that is the heart of the argument. Pastoral perspective. What difference does it make? It is worth closing by addressing why any of this should matter to faithful Christians. After all, the Gospel writers did not compose their narratives to settle a calendar debate. They wrote to announce the theological reality of God becoming flesh. The precise historical month or year does not change the core truth Christians confess. The Word became human. God entered history. Redemption was inaugurated. Yet historical precision matters in its own way. Recovering the likely season and year enriches biblical imagination. It helps us picture the scene more sharply. Mary and Joseph traveling in mild weather, shepherds under a harvest sky, Sukkot pilgrims rejoicing with lights in Jerusalem. It deepens our appreciation for the scriptural clockwork, where liturgy, prophetic fulfillment, and human events intertwine. It also sharpens our historical witness. When Christians claim that Jesus lived at a particular time in history, we should be willing to interrogate the sources and admit what is certain and what is probable.
Finally, this inquiry models a practice of faith and reason, honoring the theological centrality of the Incarnation while honestly wrestling with the messy work of historical reconstruction.
That stance treats the Bible as both sacred text and historical witness, beloved for its theological claims and worthy of careful historical reading. Resources and further reading. For those who want to pursue this topic further, the description below lists primary texts and key studies: Luke 1 through 2, Matthew 2, John 1:14, Josephus's Antiquities, astronomical studies discussing the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions and East Asian guest star records, and early patristic discussions about dating the Nativity and the development of the Anno Domini system. Those works show where the evidence is strong, where it is ambiguous, and how different scholars have weighed the clues. A final word on our title: The Real Date of Jesus' Birth, 7 Biblical Clues Historians Struggle to Explain. The struggle is real because the data are fragmentary, the traditions layered, and the interpretive moves complex. What historians can do, and what we have tried to do here, is lay the clues side by side, explain their evidentiary weight, and let the reader see why a fall birth, most plausibly in September or October within the mid-first decade BC range, emerges as the best fit for the cumulative evidence. If this investigation has sparked your curiosity, the interactive timeline on screen will let you follow the movements of Joseph and Mary, trace the Magi's route, and see the astronomical events plotted against the temple calendar calculations. It makes the argument visual and helps you judge the fit for yourself. No single date can capture the mystery of the Incarnation, but as we track these clues, political, agricultural, liturgical, and astronomical, we discover a remarkable coherence in Scripture's hints and in the historical record. The season and the year may still be debated, but the point that matters most for faith remains unchanged. God entered human history at a particular moment, in a particular place, among ordinary people to make himself known. That truth shapes worship and life far more than the inscription of a calendar. If you want to explore the maps, timelines, and primary sources yourself, watch the companion Jesus' Life on a Map video now, and be sure to like and subscribe for more evidence-based biblical history.